Hello. So today we're going to discuss Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak's essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? And Can the Subaltern Speak is a foundational text in Marxism and post-colonial theory, gender studies. It is one of the most, I think, impressive pieces of Marxist scholarship of our time because it touches on the relationship between capital, colonialism, gender, um, and one's capacity to be audible and to achieve personhood um, in context of extreme inequality. So there are many interpretations, and mine is just one. And I will discuss other scholars' interpretations of Spivak's work as well. And I will also make reference to the actual text. Can the Subaltern Speak? And finally, I'll finish by discussing some of the ideas from Homi Bhabha's work, The Location of Culture. Spivak and Bhabha are two world-renowned scholars in the field of post-colonial theory. So Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak's essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? Offers an analysis of colonialism that affirms the relevance of Marxism. And what reviewers of Spivak's work have said is that this essay hones in on the historical and ideological factors that obstruct the possibility of being heard for those who inhabit the periphery. It is a probing interrogation of what it means to have political subjectivity, to be able to access the state, and to suffer the burden of difference in a capitalist system that promises equality, yet withholds it at every turn. So, since the publication of this essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? The work has been cited in many ways. And Gayatri Spivak has discussed the essay throughout the world. The essay asks us to think seriously about the problems of subaltern subjectivity and life and death. So I will discuss three themes. Firstly, gender and post-colonialism. Secondly, Can the Subaltern Speak? The essay itself. And finally, I'll finish by discussing the location of culture and some of the key terms from Homi Bhabha's text, which is also a really well-cited piece of scholarship in post-colonial studies. So firstly, gender and post-colonialism. So post-colonial and feminist theorists often argue that women are oppressed by both patriarchy and the colonial power that structures patriarchy, even after formerly colonized countries achieve independence. So, gender and post-colonialism as a field of scholarship has really expanded over the years, particularly I think, due to interventions from queer theorists who have looked at the ways that gender itself was a colonial construct. And even after formal independence from colonial rule, attitudes towards gender, sex, sexuality, queerness, marriage, and the body continue to be structured by colonial law and by Victorian ideals. So this is a clip of Gayatri Spivak.
Are you having?
And far from being just a theoretical exercise, I think that post-colonial feminist and queer theory allow us to think about really practical political problems, such as the refusal to legalize queer marriage in the global South, or the sanctioning of marital rape in countries like India. Now, far from being a product of localized religious tradition or culture, colonial law has really shaped the ways that one understands marriage, sex, gender, child rearing, and the family. So this is a clip of Gayatri Spivak.
For me, the title has been Being, Living, Knowing. I just mentioned this because I will go from one to the other. It doesn't matter that much, but nonetheless, that's how it is. And in fact, I am deeply grateful to Professor Manisha Pandey for having invited me to offer the concluding lecture, which is indeed an honor, and for having been there for me throughout what was, for me, a difficult time. I had COVID, recovered, and slowly worked myself into a life that got extremely complicated, and she was right there. I am honored, of course, that the Vice Chancellor, Professor Najma Akhtar, agreed to chair the occasion, and I'm certainly aware of her work in education, and this puts us together because in whatever way, I can't say well or ill, my life more or less has been devoted to the idea and practice of education. Happy 100th birthday, Jamia Millia Islamia.
Sorry, I'll play the rest of the clip in a second. Many of you have an interest in the global South and formerly colonized countries, and many of you are from countries outside of what would be referred to as the global North, and you might be interested in looking at the work of Gayatri Spivak and specifically the kind of work she has done to promote education in India.
Our treasured place. I'm very aware of the grandeur of the university, and also I have been at Jamia in person a number of times. I want to come back there as soon as possible. I am, in fact, particularly delighted to be invited to speak at the Department of Sociology. English was my home from 1957 to 1962. I had wanted to be a physicist, but thank God I failed the mathematics exam for entering Presidency College. And in those times, it was Presidency College or nothing. And so I said to myself, I came first at the university in English without really trying. They can't not get me in. So this was the dubious reason for my moving into English. But soon I realized that I'd done the right thing. So it was my home from 1957 to 1962. In 1962, and I will tell you the story, I stepped into comparative literature, English, French, and German. In 2007, I received the undeserving honor of a responsibility for the humanities as a whole. This, for me, has come to mean the humanities beyond the discipline. The discipline of the humanities tightens humanities into a package. That's not where it should be. Given this history, any recognition from the social sciences seems an unexpected prize. So thank you very much indeed. In October 2018, I was invited by the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra in Portugal, the oldest university in Europe, to give the inaugural lesson for the first batch of PhDs. Again, I was charmed that they had thought to ask a teacher of the humanities for this important occasion, speaking about the fact that Professor Najma Akhtar is the first gender female vice chancellor. I should say that I'm tremendously intellectually insecure. This is ridiculous. After all, I've been teaching for so long that I shouldn't be so terrified, but I am, because although my parents were totally a kind of pre-feminist, feminist kind of household, once I entered a co-educational college, there was such bad gendering at presidency, not among the teachers. Teachers were wonderful. Among the students, oh, Gayatri, she's not really brilliant. The teachers like her because she's good looking. I used to be. And they would say the really brilliant person is Surajit Sen. You see, this idea that I was only liked by intellectuals because I was a good looking girl, this is the worst kind of gendering and leads to a lifetime of intellectual insecurity. You never know as to why people are saying, even now, as I'm so old and certainly not a delight to look at, I still feel, God knows, I may be just a token. But at any rate, I was charmed that they had thought, because of my intellectual insecurity, to ask a teacher of the humanities for this important occasion. My title for them was Study, Know, Learn, Hear, Listen, Do, ? Humanities for Social Studies. This was my title. This is how I explained my title to them. So, and I'll tell you a little bit about how I explained it, because it relates to what I'm doing today, humanities and sociology. I told them that this title summarized my idea of the humanities as training in imaginative activism. I will dwell on each cognitive position, I told them. Studying, knowing, learning, hearing, listening, and then doing with the question mark. The question mark, the hard one is from knowing to learning. As you at this great university are aware, learning must be done very well. I don't have to tell you that. But there, the object of investigation is just that, an object. We learn as well as we can, all documentation, but it's the object of investigation is an object. And in my title, there was a question mark at the end after do. It is because there is no direct line from knowing to doing. There is no direct line from knowing to doing. So when we speak about diversity, we must be aware of this. The fact of an institution of knowledge which reflects diversity at a certain level does not, in fact, secure this line at all. I told my colleagues there that I would dwell on each cognitive position, that the hard one, as I just said, was the necessity to move from knowing to learning. And as I said, in knowing, the object of investigation is an object. To move to the next stage, from knowing to learning, the object of investigation must itself become something like a subject. Manisha mentioned this. The object, and I'm very glad that you actually picked up on this basic thing that I have been trying myself and not succeeding. It's hard. It's hard, but you still resist as much as you can, simply the idea of knowing well. And that's what is encouraged these days with the way education is going. Speed and efficiency are encouraged. And therefore, the idea of this move, if we in the humanities don't come forward to offer this, there is no hope for social justice. At any rate, so therefore, the object of investigation must itself become something like a subject, and only that can lead to a change in practice. It's a scary moment when this happens. What do I do? Our formulaic description of the effort to make this change is a prayer to be haunted by what I'm learning, because I can't do it myself. It is like in Bengali, we say, bhar karo, amar upar bhar karo, haunt me. And this is a prayer, a position of mine that I'm describing this in a secular way. It's not like knowing at all, because being haunted is unanticipatable. It happened because you're working hard. And you know, this is something that philosophers all over the world have, first philosophers have acknowledged. You folks have spoken about phenomenology in your Lebenswelt, life work. But in fact, think about Aristotle when he talks about the fact that we can only go through mimesis very, very carefully. And by chance, perhaps it will become poiesis. This thing, to be haunted, is unanticipatable and it's not periodic. You can't make it happen. You can only try. So
I'll post the slides online and you can watch the entirety of the talk. In the interest of time, I'll only play that much. I think the relationship between knowing and doing is something that is central to Spivak's work. And we've discussed the concept of epistemic violence and the ways that who knows and who has the capacity to produce knowledge is a very political question. And making it impossible for one to be taken seriously as someone who knows something is, I think, central to maintaining hierarchy. And it's central to also racism. If the only people who can know what racism is must speak in the Queen's English and have a considerable amount of financial capital and a whole series of degrees from elite institutions, then obviously there is a relationship between knowing what racism is in theory and doing nothing to promote the interests of the poorest people, who are not those who can claim to know what racism is. So language has been really central to the ways that legal claims and claims of discrimination are made and also discounted. Having a certain academic prowess to describe discrimination with reference to theory or history and in rational terms is central to how people are believed. And of course, the irony is that those who are subject to, I think, the most extreme forms of violence might lack the language in which to articulate their discrimination. And this idea of knowing and doing, I think, is also interesting. And in my own opinion, I think that many people who are the most oppressed and or who are subject to the most kind of insidious violence often do not think that they are subject to violence or do not think that they are being abused. And this has been a central problem for the feminist movement, is that it is often the most educated people who are free from constraints and free from domestic violence or child abuse that often can articulate themselves as feminists or as queer. And one of the problems with social justice is that those who might experience what would objectively be termed violence, to the point that it would compromise one's quality of living and lifespan, might not see this as violence. So post-colonial and feminist theorists state that women are oppressed by both patriarchy and the colonial power, and that this is an ongoing process in many countries, even after they have achieved independence. Thus, women are colonized in a twofold way by imperialism and male dominance. So the question of agency then, what I'm trying to say is that the question of agency has been central to both post-colonial and feminist theory, that this problem of agency, of choice, of consent, I think, is central to questions of injustice. If one consents to being abused, or if one consents to being in relationships of economic injustice, then is this consent? And then obviously the question is, what else would one consent to if they did not consent to certain relationships? And it takes us back to Marx, Karl Marx, who we began by reading Marx's theory that if people do not consent to being exploited in the labor force, then what can they consent to? So Chandra Mohanty's work, Chandra Talpad Mohanty's work, is also a well-cited essay in post-colonial studies and gender studies in the field of the humanities. And the essay, Under Western Eyes, argues that the third world woman is treated as a singular monolithic subject, and that this third world woman is an appropriation within a codified scholarship created by certain Western feminists. So Mohanty was interested in the ways that this character, the third world woman, appears in all of these different texts, and often within a binary relationship between the European or Western woman or person, who is seen to have things that the third world woman does not. And this kind of monolithic figure is used to support narratives of Western superiority. But it is also obviously used to mask class differentials within the global South. So this is a clip of David, who runs this channel, Theory and Philosophy, and it is David's interpretation of Chandra Mohanty's essay.
And if you could just say your name and great.
Robert Brown. Well, I'm covering a whole array of different topics. Hey everyone, back again. Today we're going to talk about Chandra Mohanty's essay, Under Western Eyes. Now, I'm in a new space. I'm itinerant. I move around. If you're new here, welcome. I'm David. I try to explain philosophical concepts and ideas in ways that make them accessible to you. So if you're new, like, share, subscribe. You can go and see the more than 200 episodes I already have up, covering a whole array of different topics. If you found this in podcast form, you're going to be able to find the video of it on YouTube, if you're into that. Or if you found this on YouTube, you're going to be able to find it in podcast form if you just want the audio. If you want to help me out, do all those things I just mentioned, like, share, subscribe. You can help me out monetarily via Patreon or PayPal, but obviously no pressure to do that. If you are listening to this on a podcast platform, you can leave 5 stars, obviously, and that would help me out a lot. Tell your friends. Who knows? They might get a kick out of it. So yeah, let's cover this short essay to kind of continue on my post-colonialism stream of thought and covering these very important texts. And something to think about, I think, when contemplating post-colonialism is exactly what that term means. What does it mean to imply that colonization has ended, to be in the post phase of colonialism? Can such a thing occur? If the effects are still being experienced by people all across the world because of decades, centuries of imperialism, then how can it possibly be said that colonization ever finishes? So what then does that mean for a term like post-colonialism? Just food for thought. Now, I think that this essay, Chandra Mohanty's Under Western Eyes, is important for a number of reasons, in that it accentuates the necessity to complicate aggressors and victims under colonial regimes. And right off the bat, she stresses that the necessity for this complication is born out of the fact that colonization does exactly the opposite. Colonization performs, among other things, it performs one action really well, and that is to reduce colonized bodies, colonized people, to a homogeneous single group that can be easily controlled, maintained, managed, placed under colonial rule. So she, in this essay, is trying to think through that and to imagine a possibility of combating colonialism without simply replicating the same homogenizing trends that colonization and colonialism use so fruitfully. Now, her specific interest for this short essay is the idea, the notion, the image of the third world woman as a homogenous category from the perspective of Western feminists, so that she herself does not commit the same kind of homogenization as she is trying to criticize. She does not suggest that there is a homogenous, monolithic Western feminism that is participating in this homogenization of third world women. Rather, her interest is in the way that Western discourses, specifically Western discourses that adopt a rhetoric of liberation, that is trying to free people in the so-called third world, trying to liberate people in the so-called third world, how all of these discourses rely upon some consistent threads, and they really are brought together via these threads. So some of the consistent themes, and if anyone's listened to the episodes I've just done on Edward Said's Orientalism, you'll know that there are some consistent themes that run through many Orientalist projects and Orientalist ideas. Some of these include the idea that the West is best. It is just superior to the East. And this is imbued, and the West is imbued with a number of qualities as a result, as being more scientifically proficient, more politically proficient, more technologically proficient, which all contribute in a repeated reduction, in a repeated homogenization of the third world as being less advanced than the so-called West. Now, in the case of Western feminism, what it does, and on its face, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, it becomes one, is that it filters its understanding of oppression, in this case, patriarchal oppression, uses that understanding and applies it to the rest of the world, as though patriarchy functions the same in Bangladesh as it might in upstate New York, which is, you know, when you put it in terms like that, it's just totally absurd. Or in Pakistan versus...
We're tired of being told to just eat less and move more.
Introducing Juniper, the medical way to lose...
Los Angeles, you know, just two, you know, in themselves, just two very broad, different regions. But more importantly than the naive assumption that their understanding of patriarchy and of gender-based oppression can just be applied anywhere else, on top of that, all of their rhetoric of trying to free or to liberate the third world woman ignores the fact that the West, specifically Europe, has participated and has conducted so many colonial expeditions and regimes, massive swaths of land placed under colonial rule, under European colonial rule. So by ignoring this fact, Western feminist discourse, instead of actually helping women in these places contribute to a similar act of reducing these women and speaking for them instead of letting them speak and listening to them and their specific needs. So Western feminists ignore the real lived experiences of regional women all across the world. And I think that this certainly could be applied to women's experience even within the United States. Differently situated women are going to have vastly different experiences of oppression, especially when you're going to consider their socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, their own gender identity, or any kind of womanhood that exists along a spectrum or outside of that spectrum. You're going to have vastly different experiences of oppression. Now, she extends this to men as well, to say that men is not in itself, in her words, a coherent group that can just be identified as the perpetrators of patriarchal oppression. She suggests that certainly we can't ignore the fact that men are 95% of the time the culprits of gender-based violence. But it's important to acknowledge the different ways that patriarchy operates in different settings. Men are going to benefit in different ways. The very category of manhood is going to be placed under relief. It's going to be questioned in different settings. Who gets qualified as a man? That is, who can actually participate in the same kind of patriarchal foundational assumptions in any given place is going to be contingent on specific regional codes, understandings as to who can qualify as a man, who can participate in the oppression of others, who is going to be forbidden from participating in these really heinous acts, and so on. So her goal is to complicate both this idea of man and woman to understand in as precise a way as possible. And this comes through by listening to people, listening to women in different places all across the world, to learn exactly what they need, what they are experiencing, and how to best remedy any oppression that they are experiencing, and how to bring men into the fold so that they don't contribute, they don't repeat the same cycles of violence. Now, Western feminism isn't just violent in its erasure of the complexities of third world women. They are also participate in just flat out oppression themselves, in associating third world women with various negative connotations, associating them with various negative attributes, including being like less developed or being more tied to tradition as compared to the so-called free liberal woman in the so-called first world, who can do what she wants with her body, who can work wherever she wants. And they associate the third world woman as being bound by a number of believed to be archaic ways of existing in the world. So these stereotypical assumptions and beliefs about third world women then come to replace the actual lived embodied experiences of these women. And then all that happens is that Western feminists, any that try to help, will just try to have their vision of the third world, again in air quotes, the third world, confirmed. And what that will do is repeat the same cycles of violence that have been inflicted likely across centuries. She concludes this essay by saying that it must be theorized, or male violence must be theorized and interpreted within specific societies, so that it isn't as though there's just one single way to understand male violence and its effects on women, but to really complicate and extend these discussions to many different people to get as large a possible grasp or as precise a grasp of these issues in specific places. And yeah, that's essentially her essay. If there's anything I excluded that you think would be important to add, or anything I misinterpreted or mispresented, I'd love to hear about it. If you like what I did, like, share, subscribe. Yeah, catch you next time. Take care.
So, post-colonial feminist theory then did a great deal of work and continues to put forward many important criticisms of the kind of androcentrism and first worldism of political philosophy, of writing itself in the English language. And Spivak writes, some of the most radical criticism coming out of the West today is the result of an interested desire to conserve the subject of the West or the West as subject. In a previous lecture, I discussed epistemic violence, which is the violence of knowledge production, and the violence of a refusal to locate knowers outside of the West or outside of the most privileged classes of people. So post-colonial feminist and queer scholarship then looks for knowledge outside of these very privileged classes and groups of people, and specifically the kind of language that one uses to make truth claims is questioned, and the ways that knowledge is produced in relation to colonial binaries of those who collect data and do colonial research and those who are studied is also questioned. So Gayatri Spivak's essay, Can the Subaltern Speak, has been cited, as I mentioned, many times. And the essay discusses the international division of labor, and also the essay discusses the idea of authorship and personhood, of audibility and consciousness. So in the essay, Spivak is critical of the ways that objectivity or neutrality is used as an idea to mask the interests of the ruling class. And in this instance, Spivak discusses the West and the ways that the position of the West or of Europe or of the global North masks itself as a very specific position. Although the history of Europe as subject is narrativized by the law, political economy, and ideology of the West, this concealed subject pretends it has no geopolitical determinations. The much publicized critique of the sovereign subject thus actually inaugurates a subject. So this kind of erasure of positionality as being something that is very specific rather than universal perhaps still explains why using the term white man or white woman is still somehow shocking to people, or it's upsetting, or it seemed to be some kind of violent gesture to say that someone is a white woman or white man. However, it is not seen to be problematic to name others. So Gayatri Spivak, as a South Asian feminist scholar or Marxist Bengali scholar, can be named as such, but to say that someone is a white man or white woman and occupies that position as a position of power still upsets people. And in many very practical cases where people of color, specifically young working class people of color, experience discrimination because of white women and white men, the use of these terms in a court of law or in schools often causes their harm to be seen to be threatening. Judith Butler has written an essay about police brutality, and in the essay it is called Endangered in Endangering, and it looks at the case of Rodney King. And in the essay, Judith Butler argues that when people are racist, they're often incapable of understanding that certain people are being threatened and other people are doing the threatening. So even calling someone a white woman or a white man in ways that point out privilege is actually seen to be threatening. And this obviously doesn't make sense if you look at who has the most financial capital in society and who is the most protected person. So in the essay, Endangering, Schematic Racism and White Paranoia, Judith Butler argues that no matter how much evidence, including videos, people could see of 6 police officers beating Rodney King, he was seen to be threatening to the police and threatening to American society. And this is something that one has seen over and over again. When an entire Black family is harassed by a white woman who threatens children, and then they try to complain on the internet, the person who is often given a great deal of sympathy from the kind of educated liberal world, including the academic elite, is the white woman. And so this kind of paranoia and schematic racism means that we're never able to perceive certain people as being under threat. And so refusing to see that this person from the West or the European subject who has benefited historically from colonial rule is a privileged subject also allows one to ignore vast discrepancies in economic privilege between white Western people in the global North and everyone else in the world. So George Yancey and Judith Butler wrote an essay about this term, all lives matter, that appeared after the Black Lives Matter movement began. And what Yancey and Butler argue is that anti-Black racism presents whiteness as the normal mode of humanness. And this kind of normal mode of humanness, I think, is what makes it impossible for people to have empathy for others. It's also gendered in nature. So the kind of real anxiety that is generated from the term white woman is perhaps because of this normal mode of humanness and the desire for all of us to be part of this kind of cisgender heterosexual human family with an archetypal middle class mother. So Spivak further states that in the face of the possibility that the intellectual is complicit in the persistent constitution of other as the self shadow, a possibility of political practice for the intellectual would be to put the economic under erasure, to see the economic factor as irreducible, as it reinscribes the social text, even as it is erased, however imperfectly, when it claims to be the final determinant of the transcendental signified. So this kind of relationship between the economic factor and the social text, I think, is interesting to think of in Spivak's work. My own concerns with post-colonial theory have been the ways that this kind of constant discussion of the global South is often used to mask North American racism against people of color who are often not the most privileged elite of South Asia. And my own concerns then extend to thinking about the relationship between the caste system and the intellectual elites of the global South and white people in North America who make a lot of money in the school system. So, Sojourner Truth, speaking in 1867, highlighted the denial of Black women as knowers via asymmetries in cognitive authority and via men's habitually constrained imaginations. Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, writing within a post-colonial context, identifies what she calls epistemic violence and claims to know the interests of subaltern persons that preclude the subaltern from formulating knowledge claims concerning their interests and speaking for themselves. These examples are part of a broader history of epistemic resistance through identifying and calling attention to ways in which knowers have been wronged in their capacity as knowers. So the point is obviously that one can dispute other people's claims to knowledge, and this is why we have free speech. And one can also dispute one's legal claims of rightness. And the law, I think, is central in making a whole set of claims regarding what one knows and what knowledge one has about, say, one's exploitation or labor position or rights. And Gayatri Spivak then is interested in this idea of how one claims to know and how we produce knowledge. So the problem is that if we produce knowledge about, say, race and racism using a certain language of, say, privilege, we're privileged in this way, we're not privileged in another way, then what limits does this kind of discourse create in one's mind and one's capacity to articulate oppression? And what constitutes privilege? And if we return to Marx, we can think about labor exploitation and very basic forms of oppression like access to housing, food security, job security. We can think about the ways that certain forms of labor are alienating. And so the very terms in which one has to articulate privilege or oppression, and the very terms that one has to articulate race and contemporary racism are perhaps part of a certain epistemology, a certain way of knowing. So I guess the question is then, is it possible to produce knowledge about the global proletariat in contexts when knowledge is often produced through networks of the most elite castes and classes, races, heterosexual families globally? And I think it is an important question to ask about education because some of the highest dropout rates and suicide rates are obviously people of color who are working class in the global north, and also people who are not the most elite castes and classes of people in the global south.
Yeah, they want to know how to get like me.
And Foucault. And hey everyone, back again. Today I want to talk about Gayatri Spivak's criticism of Deleuze and Foucault, and also Guattari, but doesn't really get mentioned because everyone forgets about Guattari. But before jumping into it, hi, I'm David. I try to explain philosophical concepts and ideas in ways to make them accessible to you. So if you're new here, you can see I have 300 some episodes already up. You can like, share, subscribe, and see episodes I release every single week, sometimes twice a week. You can follow me on Instagram at theory_and_philosophy. If you found this in podcast form, you're going to be able to find the video on YouTube if you're into that. If you found this on YouTube, you're going to be able to find just the audio on pretty much any podcast platform, all under the same names. So go do all those things. You can help me monetarily.
I've also talked about this before in Theories of Race and Racism, or in my critique of the book Theories of Race and Racism. My interpretation is that our experience of capitalism is also, I think, really interesting, that many Marxist theorists and many academic theorists who are the most critical of capitalism often occupy positions that I would argue historically and in terms of the institutional power they have, and even in terms of their own social location, as being people who have always been part of the ruling class in some way. So elite white men in the global north and elite Brahmins often produce knowledge about capitalism as being exploitative. And the irony of this is that I think that there are many people who are, say, Dalits in India or people of color in the global north who actually might feel as though capitalism, particularly in the time of internet-based technologies and financial credit and lots of MBA programs online, the capitalism might actually be more transparent and might lead to less forms of institutional violence than, say, the school to prison pipeline, which often involves the use of the school system to police and ridicule people, even to perform some sort of eugenics against people who could participate in the modern capitalist world without having to be subject to institutional discrimination in schools and by the state.
Join our PayPal, but no pressure to do that. Liking, sharing, subscribing really does the trick. Now, this is an interesting thing I looked into. Now, I've covered Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak in its entirety on this channel as well, and you can go find the episode I did on that. And in that episode, I recounted how Spivak criticizes Foucault and Deleuze. And I approached that with my understanding of Foucault and Deleuze from their own works, which I've covered a number of their texts on this channel that you can go and see if you'd like. But I hadn't realized that she's actually really drawing from a single interview. She does draw upon their other works as well, but really there's a central interview or conversation between Foucault and Deleuze that she's picking from, which presents some problems as far as her approach goes. And I'm not going to get into the weeds of it, but to put it really simply, it doesn't fully account for the entire breadth of their projects and really the nuance that they lend to their projects within all of their other works. In any case, I didn't know this conversation existed. So in a few weeks, I'm actually going to cover that conversation between Foucault and Deleuze in another episode, and that's going to usher in the series I'm doing on Foucault's lectures at the Collège de France. So you can look forward to that. So you should subscribe, and then you can see it when it comes out. Now, as far as the criticism goes, Spivak is concerned with the way in which Foucault and Deleuze uncritically use the discourse of heterogeneity, of subjectivity, to understand the way the power operates. Now, they do this differently in their works, and I could go through each one of them and explain how they're different, but that would take a while. Instead, how they are the same and what Spivak is picking up on is that subjectivity is something that is largely constructed in the eye of power in order to render people more productive, more efficient, more operational within a specific social, cultural, economic paradigm. So there were different forms of power, different institutions of power, that were put together or that operationalized a certain discursive regime to render people as instrumental as they can possibly be for the functioning of that institution. So in the case of like the army, which is something Foucault writes about a little bit, it sought to implement a very coded regiment into its operations in order to make the people within it as docile as possible, to make them the best kinds of warriors and fighters that they could be. Now, this struck at their core by limiting the ability for possible transgression, and they were able to do this, or these institutions were able to do this by repeatedly making people do the same thing over and over and over again, and to convince in them that the punishment that they might face if they did not comply with the orders that were given to them were going to be greater than the possible harms that might be inflicted on the battlefield. So all of this worked to create this kind of subjectivity, these kinds of subjects that were going to be ripe for control, for docility, so that they can be best used. Now, that does comply more broadly with Foucault's work. Now, in the case of Deleuze, he, on the other hand, is more concerned with the way that subjectivity is not a unitary thing. Rather, every single subject is comprised of what he and Guattari might call multiplicities. There are many different parts to us. There are many different parts to the power that is imposed against us. Now, what power tries to do is it tries to reduce subjects to very manageable forms. So this sounds like Foucault. It tries to reduce these multiplicities to manageable, total, homogeneous categories. And Deleuze responds to this, and Guattari, by advocating for identifying the ways in which that humans are multiplicitous. We are comprised of many different drives, desires, beliefs that essentially make up who we are. Now, Spivak is concerned here because in both of these considerations, there's no real attention given to ideology. And she isn't totally clear in how she's positioning herself in relation to ideology and how she imagines ideology here. But what we can glean from her criticism is that hers is somewhat in line with the Althusserian notion, and I say somewhat with a big asterisk, with the Althusserian notion of ideology that works specifically to normalize, and also Gramsci is relevant here, to normalize capitalist modes of production and the relations found within this economy, within the capitalist economy. So ideology serves a very specific function in rendering people docile in a lot of cases, rendering them productive for this very big,
very exciting, life-changing,
challenging, memorable
economic enterprise, economic structure that has come to command every single part of our lives. Now, under this system, within ideology, and we can hear Zizek screaming in the background, but it's not important to go into him too much. What we can hear within ideology are false beliefs being espoused by people within it, where people are being duped because of this ideology to believe that capitalism is the only way to organize economic relations, and the type of social relations that emerge from it are also normal. The types of relations people have with their teachers, with their parents, in romantic partnerships, like all of these things are going to be characterized, they're going to be colored by the economic conditions that we find ourselves in under a capitalist economy. Now, when Deleuze and Foucault are interested in the way that subjects are able to actually speak against power just by virtue of them speaking, like in the case of Foucault, talking about how subjects within like prisons are able to offer us an anti-penal or an anti-carceral discourse just by virtue of them talking, because they're able to provide accounts of the horrors of the prison. When he does this, he is suggesting that there is no false consciousness that ideology would create. Instead, there is just any kind of belief can strike against power in any kind of setting. And what this does is it really undermines the power of ideology, and it undermines the power of the capitalist economy in exploiting people, no matter what they really say about it, no matter what they really think about it. So to locate transgressive potential within the utterances of people who have been subjugated is to deny the fact that the exploitation is still going to occur even as these utterances are said. Moreover, it's quite problematic in the way that both Deleuze and Foucault frame the possibility of speech, where for Deleuze, it's like Judge Schroeder, not totally relevant. If you want more on that, go listen to my episodes on anti-Oedipus. But they use Judge Schroeder as someone to convey their theory, to put forward their theory of an anti-Oedipal psychological paradigm, what they regrettably call schizoanalysis. And so in all of this, what they are effectively doing, that is Foucault and Deleuze, are normalizing and rendering transparent their position as simple mediators between the subjugated and the rest of the population, and the powerful even. And they are able to bring those words, they claim to be the ones bringing those words to the people, to make it known how power operates, which is a very noble task, and it's something that Spivak is very happy about. But it falls short when actually accounting for possible transgressive potential, because it is only replicating the same system of speaking for others or filtering someone else's speech through these powerful institutions and through these powerful figures. Foucault and Deleuze are among the most elite in that setting in France in the early 70s, and all throughout the 60s. Now, of course, Spivak is not concerned so much with imprisoned people in France in the 18th and 17th centuries. She's interested in people who have experienced colonization all across the world at the time, like in the 70s. Like, she wasn't, not necessarily for her, but when Deleuze and Foucault were writing, their theory of power and of subjectivity doesn't seem to hold when we try to apply it against colonial regimes, and the way that colonization strips people of their ability to actually speak. And it filters the very possibility of speech through a regulatory mechanism that is going to severely limit what can be said, which explains for Spivak why people like Foucault and Deleuze, when they engage with the quote unquote other, which is already a romanticized, fantastical figure that complies with various Orientalist themes in a lot of cases, this other is always going to be the people who are the most elite in those settings, who have the ability to speak the right language that can be understood by these French mediators, these neutral, objective French mediators who are going to lend credence to the subjective voices of these privileged people in these settings. And the same, it should be said, can certainly apply to Spivak. I've heard a number of criticisms from people to suggest that Spivak herself, being of the upper echelon in her setting, is problematic in her characterization, speaking for marginalized people, even within India. Now, in opposition to Deleuze and Foucault, Spivak draws a lot upon the work of Jacques Derrida, which might seem strange. I mean, he's positioned very similarly to the other two. His Algerian background notwithstanding, Derrida presents a way to engage with power without replicating it in the same ways that she sees Foucault and Deleuze doing. Because within Derrida's work and within his theory of deconstruction, which I've done an episode on, and I've done episodes on his other texts if you want to go check those out, within his theory of deconstruction, he is directly calling out the very dependence of the category of transparency, which is often just embraced uncritically by people like Foucault and Deleuze, according to Spivak. They just embrace this transparent neutral status. Derrida demonstrates the extent to which that transparent privileged position is dependent upon a hypervisible other that always comes to haunt that privileged position and to steadily undermine it. But in order for that to do so, for Spivak demands an engagement with these settings, like not as just a site of compliance with basic French norms or values or understanding as far as intellectual pursuits can go. Instead, it demands a more fruitful engagement with these cultures and to embrace them as they are, to open up as much of a possibility for speech as possible. Now, Spivak isn't quite as prescriptive as this as I can recall, but in any case, her privileging of Derrida, her appreciation of Derrida, is precisely in opening up this possibility of interrogating the very binary upon which Deleuze and Foucault's theories rest. Now, like, they're clearly, anyone who's read a lot of Foucault and Deleuze would scream that, no, that's not what they're doing. That's not what they're doing. And I would tend to agree. But in any case, I think that her points are extremely valid in that it really draws attention to the subtle ways in which these people who are quite radical, how their projects can actually come to mirror the very things that they are trying to criticize, and how they replicate similar structures when applied against different kinds of oppression that are, by and large, extremely violent, like colonialism, for example, and how their theories don't fully account for that, and in fact intensify those conflicts in a somewhat discursive way. But yeah, in any case, if there's anything I left out, I'd love to hear about it. Anything I got wrong, I'd really love to hear about it. And yeah, stay tuned. In a few weeks, I'm going to cover that conversation between Foucault and Deleuze in a lot more detail. And then from there, I'll move on to Foucault's lectures at the Collège de France, and it'll be a great time. I think there's like 8 books. Wow, I have so much time, and of course I can do that. All right, well, on that note, like, share, subscribe.
So that's a clip of David, who runs this blog, Theory and Philosophy, online, and it's a channel of him discussing various books and ideas. So epistemic violence is a term that we've also discussed in previous lectures. And the Spivak essay is quite rich or dense, depending on what word you would like to use. It's an essay that really grapples with a lot of questions regarding the possibility of political agency, subjectivity, audibility, of one's capacity to articulate oneself within context of extreme exploitation. And more specifically, it's not one, it is the possibility of the most kind of marginalized person, who in this essay is a woman who has been subject to colonial rule and economic exploitation in the global South. And what are the terms in which someone can articulate themselves and claim some sort of agency? And I think it is a really good question to ask. And it's a good question to ask in relation to Sojourner Truth's writings regarding the refusal to understand Black women to be people who know what racism and sexism and class exploitation are, because of the history of the transatlantic slave trade and because of the history of anti-Black racism against Black women. So if these people who actually experience historical violence and atrocity and the most extreme forms of economic exploitation are not those who know, or are not those who know, what discrimination is, then who does know, and who can claim the authority to make these claims of what is colonial violence? And Canada is a really interesting example, because many of the people who produce knowledge about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls are not Indigenous women and girls. And a lot of the knowledge production about Indigenous peoples is often produced by settlers. So if this is the kind of knowledge that is produced, if the terms are always kind of set by colonial institutions like the school or the settler state, then is it possible to ever trust the voice of those who actually are the most marginalized and who don't speak in this kind of Queen's English grammar about oppression? I think it's a question that one will always come back to when we think about race and racism. And it's a question that I think really irritates people who understand that white liberals who are very privileged often can command a certain language regarding colonialism and racism and feminism from their extensive schooling or reading, and can look quite good doing it. And whenever there are instances where people of color and indigenous people who don't have as much education try to kind of name oppression, I think it makes people very anxious because the knowledge is not produced in a certain branded fashion that is quite saleable. So the knowledge produced about, say, colonialism and racism can often be quite saleable when it is presented in this kind of way that promotes the interest of the white cisgender heterosexual middle class intelligentsia. It's kind of a gentrified sort of knowledge where it's kind of what Slavoj Žižek, the term that Slavoj Žižek uses, or this kind of joke that he always makes, is fat-free chocolate or cigarettes without nicotine or alcohol-free beer. And so you have anti-racism without people of color, or you have post-colonialism without the indigenous. And so this is the kind of danger in this sort of brand image. At the same time, one would also argue that the capacity to read and to write in the English language using the most resources possible and perhaps the best libraries possible to have access to the most information is something that one would want for people who have not historically been allowed to read and write. And so if we were to think about who was not allowed historically to even read and write, those who were enslaved were not allowed to read and write. And Black women historically have often not been encouraged to read and write because of slavery and even because of patriarchy. And this is also true of women in the global South. So these arguments regarding knowledge production and literacy and the production of knowledge, I think, are complex. Homi Bhabha's work, about nation and narration and the location of culture, is also a really well-cited text in post-colonial theory. And Bhabha offers a really interesting discussion regarding hybridity and the idea of mimicry among the colonized.
How the Light Gets In is the institute of.
So this is a clip of Professor Homi Bhabha. And the location of culture was a really well-cited text when I was a graduate student, and I had to read it. And Bhabha moves away from these ideas of binaries, and it's something that a lot of post-colonial scholars and critical race scholars constantly try to do, hence the kind of air quotes around race while also being cognizant of the existence of racism. And so many kind of critical theorists try to move away from the idea of essentialism. Judith Butler's work regarding gender asks us to question the workings of gender, while Judith Butler obviously would understand that rape as a crime often afflicts women, including trans women, at a greater rate than other genders of people. So this kind of understanding of essentialism as being problematic, while also wanting to critique the workings of essentialism, is central to a lot of post-colonial theorists' claims, including Homi Bhabha, who advance these ideas of hybridity and ambivalence to discuss colonialism and colonial discourse.
Arts and Ideas Unique Festival, combining days full of talks and debates in philosophy, politics, arts and science, with evenings full of music and dance. Get your tickets for the world's largest music and philosophy festival at howthelightgetsin.org.
I first thought of the concept of hybridization when I tried to understand how people who lack power and authority can actually enter a negotiation and make demands which combine or mix up or destabilize the assumptions of power on which they have been, which they're asked to invited to converse. So I think post-colonial studies is nothing other than thinking about the moment of enlightenment in relation to colonization, thinking about the construction of nation and civil society in the West, while Western powers were involved in creating colonies in the what we now call the global South. Of course, that's not what it was called in those days. So post-colonial studies is about the connections between things that we have often not put together, to say that the Enlightenment also had its origins in empire, that Bentham's notion of the panopticon was first tried out in India, that John Stuart Mill, whose word on liberty is accepted everywhere in the world, says that I am a Democrat in my own country, a proponent of liberalism, and a despot in somebody else's country, as a member of a colonial power, as the subject of a colonial power. So John Stuart Mill's paradox, I am a Democrat in my country and a despot in somebody else's country, gives you in brief the whole story about post-colonial studies. How do we think about democracy and despotism coexisting in different parts of the world, but at the same time? And what are the lessons we learn from there?
So if we were to think about this idea in relation to race in this time period, one can think of the ways that these cases of anti-Black racism that have been present in the media, the killing of Trayvon Martin, of George Floyd, Freddie Gray, all of these cases involve this kind of paradox of people who were considered to obviously be persons, to be parents, to be children, to be community members in one context, and then were considered to be so lacking in rights that they were killed by the state.
And of course, this issue is one that bedevils all of modernity. Slavery, after all, was considered to be an economically advanced modern concept of dealing with questions of trade and production. Empire, nobody said imperialism or empire was unjust. Initially, the justification for it was that it would modernize and Christianize many countries that were actually being ruled upon by Oriental despots. So really, post-colonial studies is about the paradoxes of modernity.
So then the question is, would the opposite be true? So if, say, Trayvon Martin was somebody's son, and then in another context was a despot who could be killed by the authority of a white settler state, could somebody be a great white person or great white woman or man or a great Brahmin woman or man in one context, and could they be subject to violence in another? And I think the answer is no in many cases, unless the violence is obviously a form of vigilantism. And this is the way that power operates. And this is the way that I think that race operates, that there is no kind of context in which someone who does not have institutional authority and is not among the most privileged caste or class or race is really then subject to the will of the people, unless the will of the people is against the law. So the law really does uphold this kind of institutional authority. The problem is when we turn to crime, and why I think people commit crime is because of this kind of dual process that one would experience. So that if one is aware that they could be made a criminal at any time, because of racism, are they more likely to then engage in crime? So this capacity to be a kind of aristocrat who turns someone into what Giorgio Agamben would call a homosacker is, I think, what leads people to commit crimes such as gangs or organized crime activity, because it allows one to have the same capacity to do away with others that the state has. And the unfortunate truth is that I think that the more that the state is involved in this kind of active killing of persons, the more that there will be crime, and crime against those who are perhaps unaware of all of the racial antagonism that exists in someone's life through the entire course of their life as a person of color, and even more specifically as Black and Indigenous people in a settler state with extreme hierarchies of class and extreme forms of alienation against specifically poor people of color.
The contradictions of the Enlightenment, which are very much with us here today. If you think about the invasion of many countries in the Middle East, Afghanistan, and so on, I don't intend putting them in a historical context, which you know, but many of these Middle Eastern interventions by Anglo-American and other powers and European powers was in the name of spreading democracy, of spreading civil society. So the old paradoxes of empire and the growth of the nation exist today in relation to interventions in countries based on the new notion of global progress.
So do you have a problem with the idea of the word post-colonial as a general concept? Because I suppose as, you know, what we might say is historical observance, we have a very clear idea of what the colonies were and how they don't exist anymore. But do you find that actually looking back on those things can sometimes actually muddy thinking about the idea of colonialism today?
Well, I have a problem with the term post-colonial when it is narrowly used for disciplinary curricular purposes. When people want not to explore its wider connotations and want to turn it into some kind of codified canonical knowledge, because as I say, the relevance of the post-colonial movement of thought is about modernity, the concept of modernity in general. It's about the notion of the Enlightenment and how do we rethink the Enlightenment.
So I'll stop it there. Homi Bhabha's work is interesting and it does discuss this idea of hybridity. So Homi Bhabha develops this notion of hybridity from Mikhail Bakhtin, who uses it to discriminate text with a single voice from those with a double voice, such as novels whose narrator cites characters speaking in their own voice. These texts are hybridic. So this idea of having two voices is something that Homi Bhabha discusses as a form of ambivalence for the colonized who can understand a localized culture while also understanding the kind of texts and laws of English colonial rule. And this kind of ambivalence is at the heart of, I think, education, because on the one hand, people who live in formerly colonized countries often speak a localized language while also going to school in English. And this could also be true of many people who have a different grammar in which they would make sense of the world as opposed to Queen's English education. So Nasrullah Membrol writes of Bhabha's concept of hybridity. One of the most widely employed and most disputed terms in post-colonial theory, hybridity commonly refers to the creation of new transcultural forms within the context zone produced by colonization. As used in horticulture, the term refers to the crossbreeding of two species by grafting or cross-pollination to form a third hybrid species. Hybridization takes many forms: linguistic, cultural, political, racial, etc. Linguistic examples include Pidgin and Creole languages, and these echo the foundational use of the term by the linguistic and cultural theorist Mikhail Bakhtin, who used it to suggest the disruptive and transfiguring power of multivocal language situations and, by extension, of multivocal narratives. The idea of polyphony of voices in society is implied also in Bakhtin's idea of the carnivalesque, which emerged in the Middle Ages when a boundless word of humorous forms and manifestations opposed the official and serious tone of medieval exclatial and feudal culture. The term hybridity has been most recently associated with the work of Bhabha, whose analysis of colonized or colonized relations stresses their interdependence and the mutual construction of their subjectivities. Bhabha contends that all cultural statements and systems are constructed in a space that he calls the third space of enunciation. So this in-between space carries the burden and meaning of culture. And this is what makes the notion of hybridity so important. Hybridity has frequently been used in post-colonial discourse to mean simply cross-cultural exchange. The use of this term has been criticized since it usually implies negating and neglecting the imbalance and inequality of the power relations it references. So when people use this term like cross-cultural communication or sharing of things, it often discounts inequality and the ways that capitalist inequality structures this kind of meeting of different groups of people. As it structured capitalist inequality, obviously structured meetings between, say, the East India Tea Company and colonized peoples. So by stressing the transformative cultural, linguistic, and political impacts on both the colonized and colonizer, it has been regarded as replicating assimilationist policies by masking or whitewashing cultural differences. The idea of hybridity also underlies other attempts to stress the mutuality of cultures in the colonial and post-colonial process in expressions of synchronity, cultural synergy, and transculturalism. The criticism of the term referred to above stems from the perception that theories that stress mutuality necessarily downplay oppositionality and increase continuing post-colonial dependence. There is, however, nothing in the idea of hybridity as such that suggests that mutually negates the hierarchical nature of the imperial process, or that it involves the idea of an unequal exchange. This is, however, the way in which some proponents of decolonization and anti-colonialism have interpreted its current usage in colonial discourse theory. It has also been subject to critique as part of a general dissatisfaction with colonial discourse theory on the part of critics such as Chandra Talpad Mohanty, Benita Perry, and Ajaz Ahmad. These critiques stress the textualist and idealist basis of such analysis and point to the fact that they neglect specific local differences. So ambivalence is also a term that was used by Homi Bhabha, and it was first developed in psychoanalysis to describe a continual fluctuation between wanting one thing and wanting its opposite. It also refers to the simultaneous attraction toward and repulsion from an object, person, or action. So this kind of attraction and repulsion is also at the heart of colonial rule, this desire to kind of know the other, but also to be revolted by the other, is central to really extreme forms of perversion, such as the kidnapping and murder of Sarji Bartman, which we've discussed in previous lectures. So finally, I'll end by discussing the idea of creativity and epistemology. So throughout the rest of the class, for the last few weeks of class, I'll make reference to this book that I wrote about artists. And the book is about queer people of color, transgender, and feminist artists in Turtle Island. And many of the artists self-identify as Indigenous people or people of color. Some do not, but the book is really about the ways that artistic work can function as a form of epistemology. So in it, I cite Theodore Adorno, who remarks that every work of art is an uncommitted crime. The idea of art as an act of defiance is deeply important in uneventful times of the political. So this kind of dual process between, say, colonial intelligence in the English language and mass consumerism and kind of intellectual labor exploitation or technocratic labor exploitation is, I think, about contemporary capitalism. And it sometimes just involves an obsession with the production of kind of cheap commodities or the production of English language terms, all of which are somewhat banal. And so I try to discuss the ways that artists often create texts that allow for emotion. So in Violence, Six Sideways Reflections, Slavoj Žižek comments on the relationship between violence and language. Žižek rewrites Adorno's famous comment that after Auschwitz, no poetry is possible. Rather, he suggests that after Auschwitz, only poetry is possible. He asserts that violent events resist full linear representation in language. Truth of trauma evades factual, rational narratives. It is in the language of the seemingly irrational, the poetic, and the affective that trauma is often cathartically expressed. So the problem with the language of race and racism is that it's often emptied out of emotion. And sometimes the emotion of race is only articulated in really violent or even criminal actions. And this could be true of the rage of the white working class, some of whom become police. It could also be true of the kind of perversions of intellectual elites, and it could also be true of gangs. So I discuss the ways that art and the artistic is a way of emotionally reckoning with the trauma of race and racism, among other intending forms of oppression, and within the context of settler colonialism. So I'll talk about the book for the rest of the class and in reference to the core readings as well from the course. And I'll finish with this quote by Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. So capital is in fact borderless, writes Spivak. That's the problem. On the other hand, capital has to keep borders alive in order for this kind of cross-border trade to happen. So therefore, the idea of borderlessness has a performative contradiction within it, which has to be kept alive. And throughout the rest of the class, I will also discuss citizenship and the postdoctoral research which I did, which caused me to move to London, England, was about citizenship. And I was part of a project called Citizenship After Orientalism at the Open University. And some of the most kind of interesting and, I guess, difficult political questions of our time, I think, have to do with the border and with citizenship, nationalism, personhood. So if we were to think about English as a form of capital, we can think about the relationship between the English language, the border, and what Giorgio Agamben refers to as the homo sacer, the person who can be killed with impunity. So commanding the English language itself is obviously a form of capital. And in this time period, the capacity to articulate one's claims of personhood in English can be a way of claiming personhood and even a way of trying to stay alive in the context of, say, war or ethnic cleansing. So that's all. And I have marked your tests and your grades are online. So please contact me if you have any questions about the grades. And I hope that you are doing well. And I will post the recorded lecture online, but we will also meet at your time, Atlantic time in Canada, on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And it will be your time, 5:30 p.m. to 8:20 p.m. Thank you. Thank you. I hope you're all doing well where you are right now. And if you have any other questions, let me know. You can watch the recorded lectures as well if you can't attend every single class because of your work schedule or time differences. Thanks. Bye-bye.